Good morning, everybody. This is Communication Strategies for Sexual Violence Advocates in Rural and Marginalized Communities. My name is Ray Myers. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a digital advocacy and communication specialist with about a decade of experience working in communications work around advocacy in healthcare, LGBTQ spaces, focusing on both legislative work at the Capitol and also organizing into that advocacy support. I've worked with major nonprofits, grassroots organizations, political campaigns, and I've even done a good deal with small businesses. Today, we're going to be talking about communications and how it can be used, how communication strategies can be used by on-the-ground organizers, especially in rural and underserved communities. In doing that, we are going to be looking at the following areas. We're going to be looking at, first off, what is communications, getting on the same page of what we're talking about. Then formats and tactics, which is the technical basis of comms and marketing. We're going to then look at stats and success, how to track your efforts and what to do with the data that you've had. We're going to then look at some programmatic challenges such as time management. And finally, we're going to look at some goal setting strategies. So when I say communications, what do you think of? Go ahead and use the link below and the QR code to visit this Menti page where you'll have the option of inputting up to three. You'll have the option of putting in up to 3 terms. So go ahead and put in terms that you think come to mind when you think about communications. Then after that, we will take a look at what answers people have. Okay, so here's what y'all put. What is communication? I see a lot of really great things here, you know, messaging, dialogue, storytelling is a huge part of the work we do through communications, helping people understand, connect with the work you're doing. And I love the fact that this main thing here in the middle is listening. And I think that's an important thing to lift up, is that when we're communicating, we are putting our information and our message out to the public, but we are also pulling the information back from the public to from our communities to actually inform and reiterate the work. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is going to be taking that response, the response of people in our communities, and taking that in and using it to inform the work that we're doing. Okay, so back to our slideshow. Now that we have that idea, let's look at a technical definition of communications. Communications is the method and strategy used to exchange thoughts, messages, or information. In our field, that might be educational material, advocacy information, or information about services available to sexual victims and survivors. You know, I think that often advocates don't always make the connection between what they do in their outreach, education, and training as forms of communication, and it absolutely is. So we can expand that out and look at a bit more of a practical definition. So our practical definition of communications, it's a little bit longer, but because we're talking more about practical things. So communications are all the ways you reach out to the people in the community for a variety of purposes, such as promoting services, announcing events and workshops, sexual violence education, awareness, and much more. Communications work overlaps a lot with outreach, advocacy, marketing, and even education. The isolated communities we're working with and the taboo nature of sexual violence issues both make relationships very important and a necessary first step to effective communication and further blur the lines between these concepts. So not only is a lot of what you do is outreach and education considered communications in one way or another, but those lines are even further blurred because a lot of the work we're doing in rural communities, slick messaging, slick communication, fancy marketing can actually do a lot to foster distrust in those communities. So building one-on-one relationships and then effectively communicating as a follow-up is often going to give you much more benefit and much more connection to your community than simply kind of creating some cool flyers or a fancy web page. Now we have a good idea of what communications is, I think. I also want to talk briefly on what communications is not. Communications is not technical support. A lot of comms is digital, but that doesn't mean everything on a computer falls under it. Issues with teleconferencing and other online tools should be handled with IT department or help desks. I put this in there because I'm somebody who works with computers quite a bit. And in my day-to-day work, I am often confronted with people who are assuming that because I work on the website or social media, that I also know how to fix their video conferencing call or help them log into something or help them get a printer working. And I think that that's an important boundary to make as you're doing communications work, that just because you may be managing a social media account doesn't mean that you don't need to go to IT if Zoom is not working or any other tools. Speaking of tools, in this work and in this presentation today, I'm going to be talking a decent amount about Canva as a graphic design tool. It's a really great tool. They actually just expanded out on it quite a bit, and it looks like they're going to be building onto some of its functionality even more so. But Canva is a web-based, highly flexible and easy to use design tool that does digital video and print. And it's free for nonprofit organizations. The link here has the application for nonprofits. If you don't already have access to it, but there's a possibility that your agency may already have an account that you'll be able to get a login to. And then if not, you can try to access it on your own. They also have a lot of really great training resources, including videos that will teach you kind of the basics of graphic design. I highly recommend it, and there will be a lot more about Canva in the toolkit that is going to be coming out by the end of this year. So with that out of the way, we understand what communications is. Let's talk a little bit about what else we have in our toolbox for doing communications work, which are our different platforms and modes of distribution of our media, of our communications information. So we have social media. This is your Facebook, your Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and quite a few other options as well. What's really great about social media is it has built-in distribution. You have the potential to reach a wider audience than you might expect if you put together a particularly good, engaging piece of content. It doesn't cost anything to you other than the time to create content, unless you're running ads, of course, which are paid ads, but you can use the base access of the platform for free. However, contact with the people on social media is often fleeting. It's hard to have deeper connections, deeper relationships. Oftentimes people are just scrolling past what they're seeing and only taking in a very brief amount of information. And in that way, it's really hard to break through the noise of social media. Everybody is vying for attention. Everybody is trying to get the attention of the users and get their content in front of people. And competing with that when you're not doing that full time can be a challenge. Some other things to note about social media is there is differing audiences on each network. The audience on Facebook and what people engage with on Facebook is different from Twitter, or Instagram, or TikTok, both in age and other demographics as well. You know, there's something that's not on here, but thinking about audiences, Pinterest is also a social network and is a social network that is often used by women who are primarily at home. And so if you're thinking about, you know, the audience of a social network, it's possible that maybe in this line of work, doing something on Pinterest would make a lot of sense. When you consider network, those things when you consider audience and network, those things tend to come up. And finally, another important thing that we're going to touch back on later is large social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, are more reliable for delivering your content often than anything that your agency can set up on their own, especially for things that use up a lot of resources like video. You're going to be better off putting any video you have on YouTube than pretty much anywhere else if your concern is getting it out to people and getting it direct to people, especially people with limited access to technology and internet connection. One other way to get access to people with a limited internet connection is through actual print materials, which I think is the other major way that we all find ourselves trying to get our information out to the public. And print materials, we're talking like flyers, brochures, business cards, zines, and even shirts and buttons and things like that. You know, low tech, easy to access, easy to get into people's hands, easy to share, easy to leave behind in community spaces. It often includes some kind of one-on-one contact with folks, which allows for relationship building. Or if it is left behind, I feel like there is something beneficial to somebody finding a piece of material, like a flyer in their community, in a community location, like a grocery store or a public meeting space, versus finding that same piece of content online. I feel like it has more impact. One of the limitations of print material is there is upfront printing costs, whether you have access to like a LaserJet printer in your office, or you need to go to like Kinko's or FedEx or one of those places and get things printed. There is a cost associated with that, which can be prohibitive, especially for limited rural programs. Another thing you might have access to is agency resources. And so this is agency websites, mailing lists, publications, think about how you can leverage existing resources to reach people. How can you share things on the agency website through social media, or through print, using something like a QR code, which you saw back on the what is communication slide. These are things that, these are ways that you can put resources out into the community without actually physically putting those resources out into the community. I do also want to say again here, rural centers or rural advocates often have limited resources. And that's when you often have to talk to the nearby centers that you're working through, and see what you have access to and how you can work with either their comms people or their comms team to try to figure out ways to put that stuff out there. Partner resources is another element that you can leverage to get your information out there. So this is other agencies, community groups, partners, including nonprofits, businesses, and even like government agencies that are operating in the same areas as you. You can ask or share your content on their social media or through their website or through their print materials or at their events. I highly recommend you work to make this as non-transactional and reciprocal as possible. So if they're sharing your events and your information, that you also be doing the same to them, for them. And this is a way to very effectively reach people directly in the community and reach people that you might not reach through other forms of communication. They may not be connected with you. They may not be interested in or advocating for sexual violence issues, but you know, something may happen. They may know somebody who needs help. They may need to have help themselves. And just having heard about the resources, say in a meeting or through another agency that they work with, might be all they need to be able to look you up and access services. Finally, we have a catch-all, which I just put under community resources. So this is like local newspapers and their websites, this community portals and calendars. Many local areas have, many cities and nonprofits have like community calendars and things like that that you can post your events on. It's a great idea to find these places in your community, keep a list, and then when you need to promote an event or distribute content, you kind of have a list you can work through quickly and effectively. When we're talking about the news, earned media can be incredibly valuable. And this is not just around your big newspapers, but also smaller news organizations. So what earned media is earned media is when you connect with a newspaper or a news source and you are featured in some way without having to pay for it. So you earn it through your expertise, through your organizational status, through your
su experiencia, su organización, su reputación, y no es una forma en la que ustedes tienen que pagar para que sean publicadas las noticias. Algunas de las formas en las que pueden conseguir estos medios de comunicación ganados o estas noticias ganadas en los medios es, por ejemplo, que un periodista o una periodista pueda escribir un artículo sobre ustedes, sobre la organización, y luego encontrar contactos con los medios y enviar un comunicado de prensa y eventualmente que sepan sobre los servicios que ustedes ofrecen. Y también tienen la opción, créalo o no, casi todos los diarios tienen, o los periódicos tienen una parte online también, entonces es relativamente fácil escribir un artículo corto para que pueda ser publicado. Y pueden realmente publicar cartas al editor y pueden escribir sobre el consistente, sobre un tema que está sucediendo actualmente, y pueden realmente tener su información publicada en las cartas a editor, en esa sección. Y eso es sorprendentemente fácil de hacer, porque muchas personas también leen eso más que otras partes. También otra forma más grande de comunicarse con el editor y con personas en los periódicos, definitivamente puede cultivarse una relación a lo largo del tiempo por medio de las cartas a editor, por medio de comunicados de prensa. Esos son algunos recursos y algunas cosas que pueden usar para comunicar y pueden divulgar información y comunicar sobre su organización y profundizar en ese intercambio. Y al final del año vamos a tener temas más específicos sobre eso, pero les quería dar un paneo general sobre estos recursos comunitarios que pueden usar. Y seguramente ven en esta lista una o dos cosas en las cuales pueden pensar. Entonces, estadísticas. Hay muchas herramientas eficaces y gratuitas disponibles para comunicarse. ¿Cómo monitoreamos la eficacia de esa comunicación? ¿Cómo sabemos que la calidad del trabajo de comunicación está realmente ayudando a alcanzar a las personas, a llegar a las personas? Bueno, tenemos que ver las estadísticas y tenemos que hacer el seguimiento de los datos para tener una idea.
Program. So knowing how to track the effectiveness of your communications work is important, not only so you know if your time is well spent, but also to report that out to the folks supervising your program and the grants that you're working on. So some tracking tools are, everything from basic spreadsheets, old school. If you're using existing software to track your work, there's often reports there that you can export. You can use link tracking. There are multiple tools out there like Bitly that are link shorteners that allow you to have a link in your material that's easy to read and copy, but oftentimes those services also track the number of people clicking on that link. You can use sign-in sheets for tracking attendance at events, and you can also use clickers for like larger scale events. So if you are, say, doing like a large community event where you're tabling, there are clicker apps you can find that you can put on your phone where basically every time someone comes up to your table, you just tap the surface, tap your screen or click your little physical clicker. And at the end of the day, you can say this many people visited our booth, this many people talked to us. And that can be really powerful information. Surveys is also another incredibly powerful tool. You have a survey at the end of this workshop to talk about how effective it was for you, and that's going to be really important feedback that we turn around and put into the toolkit and other workshops. And then finally, anecdotal evidence, which is just talking to people and hearing what people have to say and, making adjustments from that. So here I have a quick question. I wanted to hear from y'all, like what other ways do y'all use to track, if you're using ways to track your work, communications work, or just your general programming work? You can share that in the chat, or you can come off mute and share.
So I do have a question for you on the sign-in sheet clicker. Does it just click? You just click it yourself to identify the number of people, but you don't have a way to actually capture the number of people signing in. You don't actually have a way to capture the sign-in.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. Thank you for that question. A sign-in sheet would be something more that you would have sitting on the table where like people can sign up to get emails, or for an event where you want to take very direct attendance. A clicker would be more used at like something like if you were at a like I said, like a large community event where people are coming through really quick. And yeah, it is a simple click. They're often, if you go on like Amazon or something and you do a search for like a crowd clicker, you'll get physical versions of them, which are mechanical devices that you can just hold in your hand, and they've got a really big, satisfying like click button on them. And then there's also phone apps that will do the same thing. But the idea for that would not necessarily be to track individual information on each person, but to be able to say, like, at the end of the day, like, we had 300 people come up to our booth, to our table, like much more of a raw piece of data like that. In the chat, Meg says unique hashtags during Awareness Month campaigns. Hashtags are a great way to track digital programs. And if you ever, hashtags are the things that you see on Instagram and some other places where they start with the pound symbol and then they have letters after them. So that is a great way. Kara says, we share related agencies events. We discuss upcoming events at group meetings. We share in mass email as well. Absolutely. And keeping track of all of that stuff is incredibly useful. I often say I've worked as a data manager for multiple organizing programs where we have online tracking systems, and I'm always telling our on-the-ground organizers, if the data isn't in, it didn't happen, which sounds a little mean, but unfortunately,
Sure.
I'm sorry, was that? Oh, sorry. Which can be a little mean, but I'm telling them more so to say, like, y'all are doing amazing work, and if you're not taking the time or you're not prioritizing to some degree getting that data in to whatever system it needs to be in, you are risking, not getting credit for that, or not making people that are controlling the money or the resources a full picture of what you're doing. So more on estimating impact. Analytics, like what you get on social media accounts, use metrics that can be difficult to interpret, and also use metrics that are not consistent across the industry. So as a perfect example, or a couple of examples, one is the term engagement. If any of y'all have ever looked into anything around social media or online, like stats, you're going to find this term engagement. It means a completely different thing on each individual platform. It's generally an all-in-one thing that encompasses anybody who clicks on a link in your post, comments on it, likes or hearts, or like emoji reacts, depending on the platform you're on. But some platforms that can vary, like how long does somebody have to watch a video before that it becomes an engagement? And in fact, on a lot of platforms, video is one of the most frustrating things, because you look at stats of how many people watched your video. An important thing to know there is, what does that particular platform consider a video watch? Facebook for a long time considered anybody who watched at least 6 seconds of a video had watched that whole video. If your video is 20 minutes long, your watch stat doesn't necessarily mean much. And oftentimes you can dig down and find out how many people watched, halfway through, all the way through, and other things like that. But if you don't know that, and you just look and it says 700 people watched your video, that seems like, oh my God, that's amazing. And then you realize that 600 of those people watched 10 seconds worth. So that is something to keep in mind, and understand that when you are talking about impact, especially on digital, that you are taking into mind those terms. But this also applies to in-person communication. This goes back to like that idea of data, or it didn't happen. How are you quantifying the work that you're doing in compelling ways? How are you talking about things like the clicker thing I bring up, because I think being able to have an estimate of how many people walked up to your booth in a day at a community event is a really powerful number to justify like your tabling fee and your day spent at that event. Other things you can often do too is things like, bundle up your marketing material, like like if you have bundle up all of your flyers or your pamphlets or anything you give out while you table, and know how many you started the day with. So at the end of the day, you know how many were taken. So you can say 20 people took this flyer, 15 people took this pamphlet. This is all useful information to then turn around and say, these are pieces of information. These are pieces of information you can use to engage how many people you're reaching. Yes, and Eva just said the same thing in the chat, the number of brochures and materials distributed. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So these are some things to keep in mind on how you can really kind of keep track of some of these things you're doing. Because you know what, like, I think a lot of this blurs into the background. Like you go and you distribute materials and you put up flyers and you do things like that, and you just consider it part of the work, and it kind of all blurs together. But tracking some of that stuff, even in a basic way, can really make a difference in how you see your own work and how you see that part of the work is valid, and also how you justify it to other people. If you spend 4 hours putting up 50 flyers, those are 50 flyers in your community that people are seeing. Even if those people don't come to your event or don't engage with the action, they're still seeing it. That's 50 places that you've put outreach material that is helping in some small way to let people know where they have resources or help combat stigma. So it's, I think it's really a worthwhile thing to kind of track those things. And then Eva also says in the chat, this can be reported on your monthly, semi-annual, and annual reports to funders, even if there isn't a line item for it in your reports, add it to the narrative section. Exactly. Build this narrative, justify and show the value of the work that you're doing. So we're going to shift now and we're going to talk some about data equity. So data tells a story. And if you're doing, if we're being effective, we are taking our data and we're using it to create a narrative and create a story. But data never tells the whole story, because we really are only going to have data on the work you're doing or the things that you choose to study in a research sense. So when you are communicating, so when you're using your data to justify your program, when you're using your data to figure out, estimate your impact, you only have the data for the things that you have the data for. And I think of an example that has nothing to do with our industry at all, but I'm reading a book talking about anthropological work within North America around indigenous civilizations. And there are records that we are finding that says indigenous people on this continent went back further and further and further than we can ever imagine.
Mucho más atrás de lo que nos imaginamos, hace 13,000 años, 20,000 años, y muchos conocimientos indígenas dicen que esas culturas lleva cientos de miles de años. Y en este libro se habla de la narrativa de que las personas que hicieron estos descubrimientos diciendo que hay civilizaciones en las Américas más tiempo de lo que estamos justificando en nuestra narrativa y cómo migraron, pero muchas de esas personas fueron ignoradas porque su información no encajaba en la narrativa actual. Eso es un ejemplo perfecto de decir que no tenemos datos, no sabemos. Y cuando recibimos datos algunas veces que cuenta otra historia, requiere mucho de que la gente...
Data is real. And that example is just one example of how data equity plays into this entire thing. So data equity is a term that encompasses a lot. It captures a complex and multifaceted set of ideas that refers to the consideration through an equity lens of the ways in which data is collected, analyzed, and interpreted and distributed. It underscores marginalized communities' unequal opportunities to access data and at times their harm from data's misuse. It raises the issue of data sovereignty and the democratization of data, and data equity pushes us to consider ways that data can reinforce stereotypes, exacerbate problems like racial bias, or otherwise undermine social justice. In a broader scale, this means that a lot of data models that we're seeing that are based around things like building consumer profiles of people. What that means is collecting information on what people that meet certain traits believe and are likely to feel about issues, and then turning that into a computer model is often biased. You've seen this in everything from, there was some AI studies that was an AI study that was designed to take, to analyze pictures of people's faces and determine their mood. And the AI was trained mostly on photos of white people. And then when it was used on pictures of people of color, it often would rate them as angry or upset or other negative emotions. You also see this in large-scale data. I've encountered this quite a bit within electoral work, where our models assume based off of things like either straight up racial information or like cultural naming of people, that they will feel certain ways around certain issues along cultural lines, which we're actually finding when we talk to people and we figure out how to talk to them, they don't really necessarily follow those views in the same way. So this includes, like for me, it's been big in issues around LGBTQ issues. Like data models will often assume people of color are less likely to be supportive of LGBTQ issues because of an overall model that says that, even though we're finding that is not actually the case. So all of this is to say is that when you're pooling data, when you're using, especially outside data sources, that you keep in mind data equity and you keep in mind stereotypes. And also remember that even if there is a broad statistical consistency within a cultural group that they're going to feel a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that every individual within that community feels that way. And often we're working very much on an individual or small group setting. So even if a cultural group sways a certain way on an issue, there's always going to be people who disagree or who feel otherwise. And then that's often where you make inroads into changing stigma within a community. I want to talk about anecdotal feedback as well. It is qualitative data, which means it's story data, and it is valuable as long as it's done in context. I don't recommend that anytime somebody comes to you and complains one-on-one that you immediately change your program to accommodate that one person. But I do think within context, it is something worth looking into. And it's worth, when somebody comes to you and says, this is not an effective way to do something, or maybe this is offensive or insensitive, or people are having trouble finding your program because you're connecting in this way instead of connecting with that way.
Usted se conecta de esta manera o de otra. Esto todas son buenas oportunidades para revisar lo que está haciendo, revisar otros datos o apoyos otros datos que apoyan eso, o preguntarle a otra gente lo que piensa acerca de esa temática y considerar ajustar lo que está haciendo. Los comentarios anecdóticos no necesariamente debe ser algo que usted reacciona, pero en ese contexto son valiosos, muy valiosos. Cuando se
community where you may not be an actual cultural member of that community. So we've mentioned this before, and this is where I get into it more deeply, is one of the main reasons to track your data is to be able to know how well your program is doing yourself, but then also to be able to advocate for your program and the work you're doing to the grantors, to your program, to other decision makers, to people that are shareholders within your program. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. We have prove. Use stats to show what your program is doing and the work is effective. That could be anything from keeping track of how many print materials you distributed. That could be looking at how many people viewed online calendar events, how many people attended a Zoom meeting, how many people interacted with you on social media, how many people gave feedback from a survey, how many people, it could go on and on. And it's great to think out of the box there on ways that you can quantify the work that you're doing. And also don't feel like you necessarily need to have huge numbers. You know, there's a context there too. I've said things like, having, depending on what city you're in, depending on what community you're in, if you table for a day, talking to 50 people might be huge or might be like disappointing depending on like what community you're in. Are you in a rural community where only 100 people attended the actual event and 50 of them talked to you? Or are you at an event where 1,000 people came through and only 50 visited your table? Those are very different contexts. But I generally suggest taking those numbers in context and being proud of them. Just generally assume that your numbers are good and be proud of them. Eva says in the chat, OVW, for example, tracks not just the amount of survivors served, but the services provided and how many times those services were provided per survivor. Yeah, and that's another really important element there is there's probably some overlap between those stats, and there's also no harm in doing that. There's no harm in reporting things out multiple ways, and talking about, like I said before, something like, do you have to reach a certain number of people in the community with materials? How do you figure out a reasonable way to estimate if you put up flyers in community places, how many people are going to see those flyers? Those are how many people on average come into that coffee shop a day and can see your flyer. Those are things that you obviously can estimate, but those are things to think about for fulfilling goals of if you have something like, how do you, how many people have seen something? You can also self-advocate with data and planning, using existing stats to inform reasonable future expectations. Again, like it takes context to know what your numbers mean. And you might not know them originally. Maybe you spend a year, maybe you spend a season tracking on your own to get a baseline of like what's to be expected before really reporting anything out. Or you report those out and then you work on trying to do better. You need to be able to plan, like to be able to tell. You need to have those numbers to tell, is something effective? And finally, expand. Use stats to include communication goals and future grants and program deliverables. This is the most important thing. If you can report on the effectiveness of comms materials and marketing work individually in grants, you can also fund them individually in grants. So you can write into your grant things like printing costs if you're doing print materials, time to create content, time to do that design work, to review messages, to get feedback. to do your data collection. And you can also put in time if necessary, if you need to bring on a comms person or a specialist to do some of that work for you, which is all incredibly, can be incredibly effective for making sure that you're like being seen and resourced in the work that you're doing. Sorry, give me a second. I am getting over like an allergy head cold thing, and I am getting a little raspy. And yes, as Abba says in the chat, these can all be deliverables and included in your future projects. Absolutely. So a lot of this data collection then gives you the ability to think outside the box. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about the fact that like sometimes feedback and data tracking tells us we need to do something radically different or the same that we've been doing. And I think that that is an important thing to remember. Effective data analysis can reinforce your case for the program that you're doing, or it can tell you you have to do something different. Of course, remember back to what I said with like data never tells the whole story. If you're providing services to a community, your data is going to say that community needs these services. And if there is a service, if there is a community that you're not accessing, you're not going to have data on that community. So when we're thinking outside the box, remember that a lack of data does not mean that there isn't a need that exists. There's a difference between the data shows that this is not needed and the data shows that the data does not show that there is a need. Let me say it, like there's a difference there in the sense that a lack of data does not mean a lack of need, does not mean a lack of opportunity. So I think that within the context of what you are able to do within your program, you should be always looking for opportunities to expand or to reach into different communities or to develop new relationships or change up how you're doing things, even within the same community, you know, within the context of what you have capacity to do. You know, maybe accessing a different community or serving a different community means actually serving a, or having another person, having more staff, expanding the program. And that's something you can justify with data. So the last thing, so now we're going to go into talking about kind of accessing communities. And when we're talking rural programs, a big barrier is often navigating the digital divide. And there's all kinds of research on this if you go and you want to look into this more yourself. But the digital divide is the gap between those who have access to digital tech and those who do not, including but not limited to smartphones, computers, and reliable internet. And this is both an actual like monetary and infrastructure lack of access to technology, which you find in rural communities. You find things like bad internet connection and like just the lack of funds to be able to buy like nice phones and computers, and also a cultural disconnect with those same things. So people who do not value digital technology or are intimidated by it because they're not used to it, or maybe they're older, or they just don't feel like that they can access that. So both of these are things when working within digital communities that you have to be aware of. Some of the numbers, for digital divide, you know, you're looking at 15% of rural adults in the US never go online, compared to only 9% of urban adults and 6% of suburban adults. 65% of rural Americans have access to a fixed high-speed internet connection compared to 97% of urban. So these are like pretty big and significant numbers. We have serious issues with accessing technology. You know, and I'm curious if anybody wants to share in the chat or come off of mute and talk about any ways that they've seen this limited access hurt access to the communities that they serve. Now I'm gonna drink some more water. Yes, absolutely, Eva. This also, digital divide also includes not having access to tools that aid with disabilities, you know, interpretation, you know, text to voice, other things like that.
I don't have the numbers, Ray, but I would say when the pandemic first began and we completely switched our counseling outreach services to virtual only, we did have higher rates of counseling appointments in general, but that, like you said,
Uh-oh, I think I lost audio from you halfway through. But okay, yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious if your drop-off rates were higher for digital than they were for in-person programs because of technical issues. And that is definitely okay, good. Yeah, we lost Megan Madison, but it's a great point. And I don't think y'all don't need to have hard numbers on this. It can be more of just like things you've seen, trends you've seen.
There's an answer in the chat, Ray.
Yeah.
Not sure if this is included, but we have a lot of over 55 communities that are closed. I have tried to get into the community to do presentations, but they seem to feel like it doesn't apply to them. So I can't get anyone to respond.
Yeah, for sure. And being an older community, I'm sure they're probably concerned about COVID on one hand, but also probably are intimidated by doing something digital, which can be a way that can apply digital to the digital divide as well. Cool. Thank you all for sharing. So some ways that you can manage the digital divide is within the work that you do. One is to just make sure that you include part of your strategy involves non-digital communications. So flyering, pamphlets, things like that. Another thing you can do is you can work, you can put stuff on major platforms. I said this back when talking about social media. YouTube is incredibly effective at downgrading videos to work over slower connections. Putting a video on YouTube is going to be more effective at reaching people with limited technology connections than anything else. Also, YouTube is designed to play on older phones. Same thing with stuff like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. These are platforms that are optimized to get the widest reach possible, which includes working on people with older technology and limited internet connection. You know, so that's something to consider. Other things you can do is make sure you have like plain text, or if possible, have like plain text versions of documents up on the website instead of just having PDFs. Or if you have PDFs, limit the number of photos you're using in them, or optimize them in a way that is set up for digital to make it a smaller download, optimize that kind of stuff, make them help people in rural communities with limited connection access your information by keeping it as simple as possible. And of course, again, a reminder, there is a divide between what is an IT issue and what is a comms issue. Things like Zoom connectivity, people being able to fill out secure forms and stuff like that is generally more of an IT thing than something that comms should be dealing with. So yeah, so now outside of digital, what other issues do we often have when trying to communicate into rural communities? One is distrust. Marginalized folks, people of color, low-income people tend to have a certain degree of distrust in becoming involved with police and other authoritative entities. This came up in some of our other discussions. How do you show up in your community as somebody capable of providing resources, but somebody who is not necessarily connected with the police? Like, how do you give people peace of mind that if they come to you, that is not going to necessarily automatically get police or other authorities involved within their business? And this is something that I've had people ask, like, how do we create a card or create materials that differentiate us from the local like public defender's office or the police department? And you can do that in one way through design choices. You can choose to be intentionally different from government agencies. Government agencies, police, they tend to have like a very go-to kind of graphic design aesthetic, and you can avoid that by softening the design you're doing. This presentation is kind of a good example. Like, this is professional, but it is also kind of softer. I'm using bright colors. I'm using fonts that are easy to read, but not like super professional technical. You can use things like lowercase text versus all caps or even capitalized text. You can also deprofessionalize. You can do that by using art, using handmade design, using non-professional design, keeping things a little bit messy. For softening, this slideshow is actually an education-based slideshow template. So if you're looking for things that are softened and bright, oftentimes looking in places like Canva or presentation information, you can look at stuff designed for education, and you can connect with that. When you're talking about deprofessionalization, you can make things that are very obviously do-it-yourself, very obviously grassroots. And one of the best ways to do that, or an example I'm giving here because I'm super into them, is zines. So zines are a way to create informational materials that is kind of like a non-professional punk version of a pamphlet. They are designed to be printed out on regular paper. They are folded and they're printed on regular letter paper, folded in half. They often, as you can see some in this picture, they are often designed to have a very scrapbook feel to them, or a very casual feel to them. Oftentimes they're designed using things like newspaper clippings or magazine photos from magazines that are done in collage format. They oftentimes have personal art that is not like overtly professional. And this is a way that you can actually include, you know, work that's maybe being done as part of the healing work, the advocacy work, the survivor groups you're doing. You could always create, you can create this type of material in conjunction with people that are survivors going through your program, as a way of healing and as a way of them advocating to help others, which for certain people is absolutely a amazing way to you know, help begin that healing process. Eva shared a link to the Wikipedia article on zines if you want more information about what they are and the background to them. They kind of like went out of fad during the like kind of the rise of like the internet and everybody being able to put stuff online. And in the past 5 years or so, there's been a real resurgence of people interested in making zines. Yeah. Excuse me. When you are, and now we're going to go in and talk some about what kind of other barriers you're going to meet when working with communities. One is reading capabilities. What is the average reading level of your community? Are you using technical language like industry language inside your materials that might be confusing to people that are either non-English speakers or English as a second language, or even just people that might have like lower reading levels? Will long paragraphs be too much for people that might have reading disabilities or dyslexia or things like that? And what about people who cannot or who can't read your language or who speak non-written languages? Some indigenous languages are spoken only, and some people obviously speak a language but may not be able to read it effectively. Have you considered what you can do to provide like links to video versions of material like put up on YouTube, so that people who get your flyer who can't necessarily read what's on it, or get a brochure and can't read what's on it, are able to click through to a video where somebody is explaining the same content. These are all definitely things to consider. And I think a trend for this, and then definitely moving forward as we talk about language, is to often keep things simple. Y'all are not trying to sell people on a product. Y'all are not trying to impress anybody. Y'all are trying to communicate. We're trying to communicate incredibly, we're trying to communicate information as effectively as we can. And a lot of times that means keeping it simple, keeping it straightforward. When it comes to translation, there is a, Eva says, photonovellas, historias, and comics are good print alternatives to video as well. Comics especially, because you reduce a lot of the complicated language down into the narrative that's happening within the illustrations of the comic book, rather than having to spell it all out. You're also explaining ideas usually through more of a storytelling element, which can be really effective for some people over just dry information. When we're talking about translation, direct translation can often be difficult, especially within some of these areas and some of the work that we're doing. So one thing to look into is people who do transcreation work instead of translation work. These are folks that are specifically doing translation, keeping in mind the fact that actual changes need to happen to the material besides just direct translation. Perhaps you're able to find and compensate somebody within the community that you're working with to do translation work. If you are unable to find a professional, or if you want to find somebody who's going to understand cultural context. Google Translate should generally be like a last resort. It does a good job at doing literal translation, but a lot of context is lost. Eva, you have an example here that you've shared before where advocate was being translated into basically a word that meant like lawyer. Is that correct?
Yes, they would use the word abogado or abogada, and it was a direct translation, often mistranslated from Google, and it meant attorney. And so a lot of our survivors thought that they were working with an attorney when they were actually working with an advocate.
Mm. Yes, exactly. So thanks for sharing that. And that, like, so people were not understanding what they were necessarily getting. And I also wonder if there were people that were interested in engaging because they didn't want to work in the legal system. That could turn people away too. So again, when doing translation, like understanding and maybe avoiding technical language is important, and also avoiding flowery language and metaphor. Again, this goes back to if you're dealing with people that might have limited reading capability, and you're working with people who may not speak English as a first language and things that are going to be translated, keeping very direct language is an important element. Here's an example really quick. The problem with metaphors, that they're rarely universal, and sometimes they can be really nonsense. Like, what's the difference between kicking the bucket and kicking the can? These are both terms that sound very similar that mean very different things. Kicking the bucket means to die. Kicking the can, or kicking the can down the road, means to procrastinate. So definitely very different ways of doing two very similar word combinations that have very different meanings. When creating content, visual considerations around photography are also important. A lot of stock photos that exist out there, graphic templates are widely available, but may be inappropriate. A lot of Canva has a pretty good selection of stock photos, and you can often find diverse people. But even within, like, even outside of like race, there are issues with the fact that, like, for instance, just stock photos are always like, or it's really hard to find stock photos of real people. A lot of them are models or quote highly attractive people based off of current social standards. So when you're picking photos and things like that, it can be really easy to pick attractive people because it makes attractive design. Which can often be like disconnecting for people within communities that are that are interested in attending your events. Again, it goes back to that kind of slickness of like, oh, the people in this flyer do not look like me, therefore this program is not for me. And that can be even exacerbated when we're talking about sexual assault survivors and the overlap of things like body image issues. So taking the time to find people that aren't the ideal weight, that aren't young, that are more indicative of the actual people that you're helping is important. And also, when working with photos of people of color, avoid choices in the same way grounded in colorism or anti-Indigenous biases, which means, you know, picking the lightest skinned Latina or light-skinned Black folks is necessary, is also another element where you're kind of leaning into ableist and colorist ideas of like what an attractive person is and what should represent that community. So vary it up and try your best to like represent the people you can represent. And also, like when working with rural communities and farm communities, try to find people that actually are the people in the community, like not those specific people, but people that are obviously doing that kind of work, and not like a staged stock photo of somebody staged to kind of do that work. Cultural considerations, look to the community to understand what events and holidays are culturally important. White culture often makes broad and gross assumptions about communities of color and their customs. The easiest example of this is like, just because Cinco de Mayo or Dia de los Muertos is coming up doesn't mean you necessarily have to do content around it if you're working with Latinx communities. There was just the thing a while ago around Walmart creating Juneteenth ice cream as a very culturally insensitive like faux pas. So when working with a community, don't necessarily think that it's okay to take an event or a cultural element if you're not familiar with the context of that element, because you can, in an attempt to actually try to connect to your community, you can end up offending them instead. So now we're going to talk about time management, which is ironic because we're 4 minutes away from the end of this. We started a little bit late, so I'm going to try to power through this pretty quickly, but also have it be effective. So what kind of things, you are a sexual violence advocate. You are wearing a ton of hats. You have limited resources, and you're trying to make the most effective use of your ability to communicate to people, create marketing materials, and things like that. Here are a bunch of things that you can keep in mind while doing this work to hopefully help you be able to manage all of those things. First off, go for good enough. Perfect is not the enemy of good. Something is better than nothing. Sometimes you have to put something out, even if you might want to tweak it longer. And you can always put it out there, keep track of how well it's being received, and then make iterations later. So the first thing is make things good enough to get it out there. And again, overly polished stuff can often be a turnoff in rural communities. Templating. Take advantage of templating in software like Canva. You can find pre-made templates and a bunch of different themes that you can then go in and change. I do recommend that if you're using a template that you don't mess with the placement of stuff too much unless you have a good idea of the design work you're doing. Oftentimes, those templates are already visually and design-wise balanced well. And if you end up adding a bunch of extra text or moving things around, sometimes you can disrupt that balance and end up with a design not quite as good as you were originally hoping. Reuse stuff. Don't start over again every time. In Canva and a lot of other software platforms, you can make a copy of an old design and you can change content and reuse it again. It's kind of like low resource branding. If you're using the same templates over and over again, it might feel boring to you, but like a lot of people might be seeing it for the first time, or the fact that they keep seeing the same flyer over and over again is actually going to jog it in their mind to be like, hey, I've seen that flyer for like 6 months. Maybe I'm going to go look at it. Again, repetition. Don't stress using stuff. We often feel like a broken record saying the same thing over and over again, but many people we meet are hearing it for the first time, or many people aren't paying attention, and the repetition is what gets them to connect. Iteration, again, reusing, updating old stuff. Get a working version, get it out there, and then adjust it based off of feedback and effectiveness. Nobody's expecting you to be like a professional designer, and again, you don't want to sit on, I hate when somebody sits on something for 6 months that's pretty solid because they're worried about, is it good enough? Integration. You know, integrate the other work that you're doing. We talked about zines briefly. How can you use a zine to, you know, a zine can be made in an art workshop with volunteers and then used as a advocacy and communications item. You can also collect people's stories. You can use your work to promote your work. You can empower survivors and empower your program at the same time. And really that storytelling and that connection through to the actual people that are being helped by your program is the most compelling way to advocate. So if you're using that, it can be really effective. And then last of the last is, you know, we want to talk about real quickly is, you know, how do you want to be intentional about your goals? I highly recommend using the SMARTY method, which some of you have probably heard about before, maybe just as the SMART method. But this is creating goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. So having an idea that's specific, that's narrow, that has actual metrics connected to it. I want to reach 100 people. I want to make 2 brochures. I want to post on social media once a week. Attainable within the ability of what you can do. If it's an amazing idea, but you don't have the resources, you don't have the resources. Relevant, does it push the mission of your program? Does it in some way connect back to the victims advocacy work you're doing? Time bound, it either has a repeating time period to it, like I'm going to do this once a week, or it has an end date. And of course, inclusive and equitable. Inclusive, is it accessible to everybody? Does it include everybody as best as possible? And equitable, you know, are we representing everybody properly? Are we helping certain people at the detriment of others? So yeah. So that's the end. It's 12:02. So if some of y'all have to head off right away, that is perfectly fine. Eva has posted the training evaluation survey link and the link to register for the social and digital storytelling worksheet, which is next Monday. Yeah.
Yes, it is 1 week from today. So if you have any feedback that you'd like to make sure that Ray gets, that training evaluation is one way to do it. You can also reach out directly, as they have provided their email on the last slide. And you can also reach out to me, of course. And so I've provided the training evaluation and also the direct registration link for social and digital storytelling, which will focus a little more on like how to basically use social media and other print mediums for telling survivor stories and reaching not just them, but, you know, community at large. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
And if anybody had any last minute questions, I can stay on for a minute or two, for a few minutes.
I'm seeing just thank yous. Thank you, Marianela. Thank you, Anthony. Thanks, Robin. And I see that it was Meg, Madison, Lexi, Anthony, Tess, and Erika.
I think that was that. Thank you for illustrating the limitations of technology while talking about the limitations of technology.
Thank you, Dina. All right, looks like no questions.
Thank you to our interpreter.
You too, Anthony.